This week, we're going to talk a little bit about trade unions and how they began, how they influenced Welsh mining, and some of the reasons why they became so popular in Wales in the 1800s. More in a second. Grioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 249, Trade Unions Growing Power. Between 1850 and 1900, Wales witnessed the birth and consolidation of organized labor. Trade unions, once fragile and easily suppressed, grew into powerful movements that reshaped politics and industry. At the heart of this story are the miners of South Wales and the quarrymen of the North, men whose daily lives were bound up with risk, hardship, and a fight for dignity. By 1850, Wales had become one of the key centers of the Industrial Revolution. The South Wales coalfields expanded rapidly, feeding ironworks, steel mills, and global export markets. In the north, slate quarries such as Penrhyn and Dinorwig supplied roofing material across Britain and beyond. With economic explosion came a population explosion. Areas that had been tiny villages or small farming communities were now industrial powerhouses. As people arrived, first from the rural parts of Wales, much of the culture of the 1850s were, for example, still largely a Welsh one. Cymraeg was still spoken in the house and at the industrial locations. That, however, had started to change. We touched on this a bit last time we had our proper episode, but populations in places like Wrexham, Newport, Swansea, and especially Cardiff were now being dominated by English speakers. In Canada, we often call these Anglophones. So if I say Anglophone, just understand that's kind of why it does. We do that because we typically call French speakers Francophones. So just FYI, if I slip into that, that's what I mean. Rhondda, for example, by 1891 had a population of 123,000, which were made up of a large contingent of English speakers. Cardiff, by the 1911 census, for example, would break 182,000, again, largely dominated by the English, or at least English speaking. This population explosion was not matched by housing, of course, which often lagged behind, which then led to other complications and issues. Frustration began to spread as industrial communities soon found themselves in worse conditions than where they were on the farms. The pay may have improved, a large driver of the move to the rural urban areas in the first place, was then not followed up by better conditions both at work and at home. Poor and overcrowded housing, where illness ran rampant, even as late as 1911, the child mortality rate in the 5 populated boroughs of South Wales was still around 1/3 of all children dying. Frightening to consider, especially and certainly spurred on action amongst the working class, who were often the forefront of this mortality. But you had to keep your job, so many suffered as industrialists, shop owners, and others capitalized on these conditions, wringing out as much as they could from their employees, and fought hard both politically and in some cases physically against any sense of organized labor. With that in mind, of course, the wealth generated by these industries rarely reached the workers. Wages rose and fell with markets, conditions were harsh, and the employers often controlled not just the pits or the quarries, but also the housing, the shops, and even local governance. The imbalance of power led miners to seek collective organization. Early attempts in the 1830s, something we've mentioned before, were largely more like a mafia movement than an organized labor movement. Fighting for rights and wages was almost more fighting than actual talking and working things out. The first significant attempt to form an organized labor movement was the South Wales Miners' Association of 1851, though it did collapse by 1853 due to employer hostility and financial strain. It set a precedent. Unionization was not defeated, but it took more time for it to find purchase in the hearts and minds. Local lodges, often linked to nonconformist chapels, carried on the spirit of unionization. Religion and community reinforced solidarity, making it clear that when one pit suffered, the entire valley shared in that burden, also helped to create an understanding and a sympathy amongst various groups. In the 1860s and 70s, colliers experimented with collective bargaining, but their power was limited. Wages were tied to a sliding scale and a system that linked pay to coal prices. Many saw this as unfair and manipulative, as it kept workers at the mercy of a volatile market, as you can understand. The case for unionization was tragically strengthened by a series of disasters. Industrial dangers were well known by the 1860s, but the tendency was to excuse excesses and poor management as a mistake that could be remedied by firing the right person or making mollifying noises. To quote our modern description, this was not really a bug of this particular idea, but rather a feature of the Victorian era coal mining. Safety conditions, poor management, and a drive to get all the money from the mines that could be pulled particularly as fast as possible, had been a historic problem in Wales. One that, of course, featured in many places, and one that still today is a concern, and we're going to talk a lot about in the coming years. It would be comical if it was not so absolutely tragic. And so I want to take some time to talk about a few incidents of note. Be aware there's more that we're going to talk about. Certainly there's more that affect Wales over the years. Some that are absolutely horrific, and all in their own way are horrific, but frightening and horrific in all new and different and awful ways, such as Aberfan. Now, let's start with the first one that we have on the list from this period. The Gethin colliery explosion of 1865 killed 52 men and boys in Merthyr Tydfil. Local newspapers reported in detail on the devastation, noting that the widows and children were left destitute. Obviously, a major problem with mining companies was a tendency to look at an employee as only someone to worry about up until their death. And quite frequently, something that we'll see happen again and again and again, once the disaster occurs, there is a notion that these people are no longer being paid, thus they're no longer the company's concern, which of course led to more and more calls for both unionization and legislation to tamp this down. The Tyneweath disaster of 1877 in Porth saw 14 miners trapped underground after flooding. 4 men survived after 10 days underground, but the event exposed the dangers of the poor safety standards. The heroism of the rescuers was widely reported in the Times, which emphasized the risk the miners were compelled to take in pursuit of a living. The Abercarn explosion of 1878 was one of the worst in Welsh history. It killed 268 men and boys. The relief fund raised £100,000 to aid these widows and orphans, but that aid was charitable rather than a guarantee. The Western Mail in 12 of September 1878 recorded the immense scale of the tragedy and entire families lost and communities shattered, with little legal obligation on the employer's part to actually support the survivors, something that is going to be a continued issue. Although the great Senghelmneath disaster would not occur until 1913, smaller accidents at the colliery in the 1890s were reported in various newspapers and became a rallying point for stronger demands for safety. So it wasn't just the financing of the people that worked at these mines, there's also the safety concerns, which came up even if you go back to earlier episodes. We were talking about these very same things in early mining, while they continue to be an issue quite frequently. The Coal Mine Regulation Act of 1872 required certified managers and better ventilation standards. Later, the Employers' Liability Act of 1880 allowed workers to claim compensation in some cases of negligence, though enforcement was patchy. As Huell Francis and David Smith later noted in their study of the miners, every great explosion added to the ranks of the organized. The blood and dust of the South Wales pits were the seedbeds for unionism. The point, of course, is clear. Laws alone were not enough. The simple fact that counting on the enforcement of those laws or for the owners and managers to actually carry out what was needed just wasn't enough to keep this going and to lead it down a right path. Action was what miners needed. They needed strong unions to make their voice heard and to reach those in power. By the 1890s, resentment towards the sliding scale and the memory of the tragedies fed into a new determination. In 1898, local lodges united to form the South Wales Miners' Federation, which became known simply as the Fed. Within a decade, it represented 100,000 miners across Wales. The Federation demanded fairer wages, stronger safety legislation, proper compensation for victims' families, and political influence. The Western Mail reported that the Federation's founding conference, noting that the new force had emerged in the valleys, one determined to protect wages and welfare with a single voice. Unionization was not confined to the coal fields. In North Wales, the slate quarrymen faced their own battles. The Penrhyn quarry at Bethesda employed over 3,000 men by the late 19th century, making it the largest in the world. Conditions were harsh, pay irregular, and owners, such as Lord Penrhyn, staunchly opposed unions. First significant strike came in 1865, and although it failed, it signaled the quarrymen's willingness to organize, and in 1874 they established the North Wales Quarrymen's Union, which provided a new platform for bargaining. Initially, the union was not led by miners, however, but by radical liberals who later became supporters of David Lloyd George's Cymru Fydd. The North Wales Chronicle in June of 1874 reported on the union's founding and noted that quarrymen had grown weary of the arbitrary dismissals, wage reductions, and had resolved to unite under one single banner. This union grew steadily and set the stage for a long and bitter Penrhyn lockout from 1900 to 1903, which began just beyond this particular discussion. The 1870s brought broader legislative changes, some of which we've mentioned. The Trade Union Act of 1871 was a landmark in British labor history. For the first time, unions were given legal recognition. They were no longer automatically treated as criminals or conspiracies under the law. For Welsh miners and quarrymen, this meant that their organizations, though still facing hostility from the employers, at the very least had legitimacy in the eyes of the state. Before 1871, unions operated in a precarious legal position. The Combinations Act of 1799 and the 1800 Act had criminalized collective bargaining altogether. Although those acts were repealed in 1824, the law remained stacked against organized labor. Courts could treat unions actively as conspiracy to restrain trade, and strikes often brought prosecution. The 1860s saw a rise of public attention to the issue. Large amalgamated unions like the Amalgamated Society of Engineers gained influence, and several royal commissions investigated whether unions were beneficial or harmful to society. The Royal Commission on Trade Unions of 1867 to 69 split into majority and minority reports. The majority backed employers, painted unions as restrictive and violent. But the minority report, authored by Frederick Harris and other sympathizers to labor, argued that unions provided vital protection for working men and should be given recognition. The government of William Gladstone, then Liberal Prime Minister, took up the minority view. Gladstone's cabinet had already embarked on wide reforms. The 1870 Education Act, the Ballot Act, and the Civil Service Reform were just the beginnings, granting recognition of unions to fit the wider liberal program of including working men in the political system after the Second Reform Act of 1867, which had expanded the franchise. Within Parliament, the measure was steered through by A.J. Mundella, MP for Sheffield, and it was strongly supported by figures like George Howell, a working-class trade unionist who became a Liberal MP. The Act's backers saw it as a way to stabilize industrial relations by bringing unions into the law rather than leaving them underground, both literally and figuratively if you think of minor unions. Opposition came from both conservative MPs and from some employers who feared giving too much legitimacy to organized unions. Critics argued that recognition would lead and encourage strikes, undermine property rights, and destabilize economic growth. The Times newspaper reflected the elite anxiety in 1871, warning that legalizing unions risked, quote, handing over the whole industry to tyranny of committees of workmen, end quote. Some radical liberals also worried that the act did not go far enough, since while it gave union protections, it did leave issues of picketing unresolved until the Conspiracy and Protection of Property Act of 1875, which was passed under Disraeli's conservative government. The timing of the act reflected both social and political pressure. Union power was growing rapidly in the 1860s, and strikes among builders, engineers, and miners had shaken employers. At the same time, working men had been brought into the electorate, and by 1867 Reform Act, the Liberal government knew it could no longer ignore them. The minority report that we mentioned earlier of the Royal Commission gave an intellectual foundation, and it gave Gladstone's cabinet the political will to be actually able to do something about this situation. The bill passed with broad Liberal support, and enough Conservatives agreed that it reached a statute. For Welsh miners and quarrymen, the act meant that the organizations that they were trying to create could openly have and collect subscriptions, hold funds, and operate within the law. It did not end employer hostility, as it never would, but lockouts and victimization, of course, continued. But it did mark a beginning of a new era where unions were recognized as legitimate parts of society and a legitimate part of business. You can't have a movement of labor without recognizing that it had a place in the economic wheel, and you had to recognize it. Even if you didn't like it as an employer, you still had to recognize the importance of it. This also meant that they were no longer criminals under the law, which was a massive win. Welsh unions quickly used this legitimacy to push for political influence as well. They backed Liberal candidates sympathetic to the labor cause and played a growing role in local and national elections. Keith O. Morgan notes that Liberal MP Henry Richards encouraged workers to see the organization as their route to fairness and political representation. Now, let me just close with a bit of an extra note on this. I would say, as someone who's only ever been in a union once myself, that the role of unions specifically in this period is absolutely fundamental to the way workers are treated and paid. It forced so much change, especially on governments who really were very lackadaisical and only really motivated to do things when there was public pressure. For them, it was easier not to rock the boat, especially with companies which had a lot of political influence. There would be a perception of not trying to get them upset. But now, as combined with the expansion of the franchise, you also have this activist notion within the trade unions, which starts to develop and continues to grow from this point onward. They become very influential, obviously, in politics later on. Still to this day, there's manifestos written for them. You have a party which is known as the Labor Party. All of these organizations exist in part to meet that demand, to meet that ideal of matching what is needed to protect workers. We can then argue around the edges of whether that actually works or functions or has created more problems or if it creates better solutions. We can all discuss those till we're blue in the face, and modern politics is still caught up in this discussion even today. It's never going to go away, but it's important to know that without the work of unions, especially in this period of Victorian industrialization, that so many more people would probably be dead, and so many more would suffer under poor wages, poor conditions, sickness, illness, diseases would possibly still run rampant. We just don't know. And that is an over speculation on my part. But what we can say is we do know one thing, is that things improved and began to improve for workers after this point. Things got safer, things got better. It isn't, rainbows and sunshine, but it is a lot better. And that's one thing we can take from this. And it's one thing that you can look back at the idea of unions and say they had a place and still have a place in society. And with all that, I'd like to thank you all today for listening or watching. I hope if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you'll reach out to me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can also find me on most social media at Welsh History Pod. The one exception being Facebook, which is facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And you can also help this series and this podcast via donations through patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all once again. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. We'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.